Hi, my name is Jenny Brown and I would like to talk to you today about a social justice issue regarding access to the curriculum and school culture for students with receptive and expressive language difficulties. But first I think it's important to define what social justice is and how it becomes an issue in the educational context. Smith states that social justice is about equity and fairness between human beings. This definition complements the goal of social justice statement proposed by Rawls, who says that the goal of social justice is to enable all people to reach their full potential and be active contributors to their community. In an educational context, social justice issues arise when students are disadvantaged by influences that are beyond their control, such as socio-economic status, sexual orientation, race, culture, language, physical and mental ability. The Melbourne Declaration on Educational Goals for Young Australians recognises these visible and invisible influences in their promotion of equality and excellence in Australian schooling. According to TRIP, teachers need to understand their own sense of justice and equality and be mindful of the social influence they have on their students in the classroom. Imagine what school is like for those students who have trouble understanding and interpreting others or receptive language, or sharing thoughts, ideas and feelings completely, expressive language. After all, school is predominantly an oral learning environment, and to be successful learners, all students need to function well in this oral environment. Language is quite different from speech. Language involves understanding the concepts embedded in words. Language is made up of socially shared rules, what words mean, how to put words together, and what combinations of words work best. The school and classroom environments have a culture of their own, and communicating to learn is central to this environment. Many students understand the assumed set of rules for who can speak, when, how, about what, and to whom. Most students pay attention to the teacher and retain what he or she says. And most students develop the skills needed in picking up cues by inference, observation, and nonverbal cues. Most students develop the skills with formal vocabulary, being specific and understanding material out of context. A student needs to understand the academic language that relates specifically to the curriculum, such as phonemic awareness, metalinguistic skills, and specialised vocabulary. The teaching standards reflect the goals of the Melbourne Declaration of Educational Goals for Young Australians by providing expectations for teachers to reduce the prevalence of social justice issues in the classroom and restore equality and excellence in Australian schooling. These standards are interrelated and highlight the need for differentiation. Therefore, failure to comply with one standard will often result in a deficit across several standards and further disadvantage the child who presents with expressive receptive language difficulties. With regards to students with these difficulties, Standard 1 addresses knowing students and how they learn. Therefore, as a teacher, I must find ways to support the oral delivery of the curriculum and personalise content for those students with these language difficulties. Standard 2 requires knowledge of content and teaching strategies. Therefore, I must consider the teaching strategies that will engage these learners and allow them to make connections in order to retain knowledge more effectively. The more I know about receptive expressive language difficulties, the more I'll be able to front-load planning and utilise visual resources to sequence learning programs that target specific language deficits. Standard 4. Students with receptive expressive language difficulties need a safe and supportive learning environment where they can learn to develop their social skills. It will be important to be proactive during these times of social interaction to avoid conflict with other students. And Standard 5, if the idea of assessment is to assess what students know, then students with receptive expressive language difficulties may be disadvantaged with mathematical word problems or activities with multiple components. Problems with the overlapping categories of communication disorders make it difficult to identify the prevalence of receptive and expressive language difficulties. A diagnosis of a language disorder is exacerbated by the diversity in which a child acquires, comprehends and produces language that may exist in isolation or with associated conditions. The American Speech and Hearing Association has provided statistics of speech-language impairment which underlie the characteristics of receptive expressive language difficulties. Speech-language impairment is extremely common in children and affects about 7% of the childhood population. Approximately 40 to 60% of students diagnosed with a learning disability have also been diagnosed with a language learning disability. Brent, Goff and Robinson state that 1 in 11 adolescents have a language difficulty, and 50 to 70% of children with language difficulties also have behaviour and emotional problems. According to Oliver, students with language difficulties are at risk of academic failure, social isolation, and being labelled a behaviour problem. Children who present with receptive expressive language difficulties in primary school will have difficulty in language-related activities, such as reading comprehension and writing, as curriculum content becomes more abstract. The verbal delivery of curriculum content is not likely to be understood and may result in inappropriate responses or failure to follow directions, which may be misconstrued as the child being deliberately stubborn. The self-esteem of this child may be impacted as they continue to perform poorly in classroom tests or labelled as a behaviour problem. As same-age peers begin to engage in more sophisticated social relationships, the social communication skills of a child with receptive expressive language difficulties may only gradually emerge. This may result in long-term psychological impairments such as depression or anxiety. While there is no denying that many children in our classrooms present with receptive or expressive language difficulties, the diagnostic criteria only recognises a select few, which according to Oliver is due to different definitions of criteria proposed by medical professionals, speech pathologists and educational bodies. The purpose of obtaining a formal diagnosis is to obtain funding and/or support for academic and social development. It is difficult for a child with mild to moderate language difficulties to fulfill the stringent criteria of specific language impairment or social communication disorder proposed by the DSM-5. It may also be problematic for this same child to fulfill Education Queensland's speech-language impairment criteria due to the variable definition of severe and the required absence of other conditions. Reid and Hand assert that problems of cultural diversity are similar to those for students with language difficulties. Therefore, effective strategies used in multicultural casework also apply to students with language difficulties, such as adopting a family-centred approach which maintains a continuum of intervention that focuses on listening and responding, paraphrasing, problem-solving, and remembering details. Recognising and valuing the strengths of each individual to nurture their sense of well-being by making them an expert in something, and being prepared to change the environment so that it is more conducive to learning, for example, providing picture clues and considering seating location of a student who presents with language difficulties. To show how important knowledge about language is in teaching, Fillmore and Snow outlined the understandings about language that are required by some of the many roles that teachers play. As communicators, they need to understand that discourse patterns are culturally determined, and that any discourse pattern is as valid as any other, and they need to understand the kinds of errors and the kind of progress that students with language difficulties can be expected to make. As educators, they need to understand language development so they can choose materials and activities that promote it, and know whether and how to intervene if a child is having difficulty. As evaluators, they need to understand that all assessments of students' abilities are ultimately language assessments, and they need to understand the sources of variation in language use. As educated human beings, they need to understand how language works and the implications of this for language acquisition, dialect use and teaching methods. Ken Rowe is a research director for the Australian Council of Educational Research and suggests that teachers speak too quickly, especially females who make up 85% of the profession, and as a result, students are drowning in a sea of blah, which may contribute to behaviour referrals. His recommendations may also benefit those students who present with receptive expressive language difficulties. We know that students with language difficulties also have problems with literacy and knowledge acquisition. We also know that language impairment is a lifelong condition. There is a strong correlation between students with language difficulties who experience academic failure and social isolation. Evidence shows that students with mild to moderate language impairment respond positively to intervention that focuses on listening and responding, paraphrasing, problem solving, and remembering details. The objective with this plan is to design a goal that aligns with curriculum content and scaffolds learning for students with receptive expressive language difficulties. An IEP for a student with receptive expressive language difficulties may focus on developing age-appropriate vocabulary and language comprehension skills and understanding of semantics. These activities require diligence on behalf of the classroom teacher, parent and student to create a continuum of learning and support to refine the listening skills necessary for academic success and develop language skills necessary for social development and interaction. The following suggestions provide options for representing the curriculum, such as visual cues and repetition, graphic organisers and concept maps, highlighting the main focus areas of learning, interactive activities that reinforce curriculum content, and text-to-speech software. Clearly, students with receptive expressive language difficulties are not auditory learners, so incorporating senses other than listening, such as visual cues and hands-on activities to teach new information and build understanding, might be beneficial. Instructional strategies and media used to deliver the curriculum must support the language needs of the individual. The success of these methods can be measured by learning outcomes and should vary according to subject difficulty. The following suggestions highlight different teaching strategies and materials, such as online animations or a daily schedule, chunking content into smaller pieces, a checklist for many learning activities, playing games that require listening and reinforce vocabulary. The research has also highlighted the need to promote and explicitly teach social skills. Therefore, the following strategies should be considered, such as think, pair, share activities to reinforce comprehension and foster social interaction, brainstorming and role-playing social skills and social conversations. Group work also allows opportunities for peer teaching. Using the student's interest to inform others may promote self-esteem. Kylie Voss and Lisa Carnegie are speech pathologists and offer the following advice to teachers. They say that students imitate language, so teachers must be sure to provide good patterns as a model. Repeat the patterns over and over and avoid constant correction. They say that if students can't say it, they can't write it. Therefore, oral rehearsal of new vocabulary embeds understanding, and close activities using the new vocabulary develops and cements an understanding of meaning. To assess curriculum content, it is important to gather information that accurately measures the student's knowledge, skills and understanding of the subject, and is not hindered by the difficulty in processing language. The validity and flexibility of assessment becomes an important consideration when planning for students with receptive expressive language disorders. The following are examples of differentiated assessment, such as choice of topics or self-assessment checklists using creative software. The collaboration of teachers, speech-language pathologists, guidance counsellors and parents and the students themselves provides insight into the child's strengths, weaknesses and interests and should be incorporated into the planning of learning goals. These stakeholders are responsible for all decisions that are made on behalf of the child, and regular communication is vital to discuss observations and improvements, and to evaluate what is and what isn't working. The time frame is ongoing because the condition is ongoing, and as the curriculum becomes more abstract, the students are going to need different strategies in order to cope with the new curriculum. By conducting a SWOT analysis, I've been able to identify the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats of this proposed plan. The strengths are obviously that giving students with language difficulties the strategies to access the school curriculum and culture, whereas the weaknesses are that it's time-consuming with no guarantees, the lack of funding for targeted intervention, and students with language difficulties are always going to have language difficulties, which means it's a lifetime commitment. The opportunities are, of course, that these strategies are also recommended for ESL learners, creates a continuum of learning between home and school, and increases the confidence of the teachers to make a difference for those students with language difficulties. The threats are that there's not always access to professional support, and that other staff members may not reinforce the strategies in other classes. Through the process of the action research cycle, I have grown as a teacher because I have developed knowledge and understanding about students who present with language difficulties. I have developed a plan for students with receptive expressive language difficulties that is supported by research and evaluated the potential of this plan using a SWOT analysis. Indeed, I have joined a noble profession that dedicates much of their own time to ensure students are provided fair and equitable access to education. I have learned that reflective practice is ongoing and informs the action research cycle. Schoen describes this as reflection in action and reflection of action, in that reflective thinking calls for careful examination of beliefs, aims, and methods leading to deeper understanding and actions that improve student learning.